Out. On a gray Wednesday morning in late October, Harrison Briggs signed the transfer deed with the kind of efficiency that comes from having done something so many times it has lost all meaning. He did not look at the man standing across the table. He looked at the signature line, filled it in, capped his pen, and handed the document to his attorney without a word. Out. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and said to no one in particular that the county had finally taken another piece of garbage off his hands. The man across the table was named Russell Cobb. He was 43 years old, wore a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and had driven 40 minutes in a truck with a cracked windshield to be at this meeting. He did not respond to the comment. Out. He picked up his copy of the deed, folded it carefully along the existing crease, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Harrison Briggs was already through the door before Russell had finished buttoning it. Out. The property in question was a decommissioned grain elevator on the rural western edge of Callaway County, Kansas. It had been built in 1954 by a cooperative of local farmers, expanded in 1971, and abandoned in 2009 when the cooperative dissolved after 2 consecutive years of drought and 1 year of catastrophic mismanagement. Out. The structure had been sitting on its 12 acres ever since, accruing back taxes that Briggs Capital Agriculture, a privately held land and commodity firm that Harrison ran from a glass office in Wichita, had quietly purchased in a tax lien bundle 3 years earlier along with 7 other distressed properties in the county. The firm's plan for the site was straightforward. Out. Demolish the elevator, rezone the acreage as light commercial, and sell the parcel to a regional logistics company that had already expressed informal interest in building a distribution hub along the corridor. The elevator itself was an obstacle, not an asset. Out. Harrison's facilities director had quoted the demolition at somewhere between $40,000 and $55,000, and described the structural integrity of the grain bins as, in his words, a question mark nobody wanted to answer from the inside. When the idea of selling the structure outright surfaced in a brief internal meeting, Harrison dismissed it in less time than it took to refill his coffee. Listed at whatever gets it off the books. Out. The number they settled on was $8,000. Out. Russell Cobb had grown up in Callaway County. His father, Gene Cobb, had farmed winter wheat on a quarter section 12 miles south of the elevator and had stored grain there every season from 1979 until 2008. Russell had ridden in the truck cab on those harvest runs as a kid, watching the grain auger cycle through the bins, listening to the hum of the drying system, learning from Gene's quiet commentary which bins held which moisture levels and why it mattered. He had not become a farmer. Out. He had become a structural engineer, specifically one who spent 15 years working for an agricultural infrastructure firm in Salina before the company was acquired by a larger competitor that had no interest in maintaining a Kansas office. That acquisition had been finalized 7 months before this story begins. Russell had been given 60 days' notice by a junior HR representative who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the task. Out. He thanked her, drove home, and spent the evening in his garage with a legal pad, not grieving, just making a list. Out. He had savings, not a great deal of them, but enough. 12 years of living modestly, paying off his truck, keeping a small house outside Larne that had belonged to his parents. He had $41,000 in an account he had never touched, earmarked for something he had never quite identified. He spent 5 months after the layoff doing contract inspections for county agricultural offices and taking whatever short-term structural assessment work he could find through former colleagues. Out. He was not idle. He was not bitter. He was waiting with the particular patience of someone who has spent a career learning that the stability of a structure is only visible to people who know where to look for stress. Out. A former coworker named Ellis, who still worked in agricultural real estate, mentioned the Callaway elevator in passing during a phone call in September. He said a land company out of Wichita had listed it for almost nothing, that they wanted it gone before year's end for tax purposes, and that the listing had been sitting untouched for 6 weeks because nobody local wanted the liability of a structure that old. Ellis said he'd pass along the address if Russell was curious. Russell said he was. Out. He did not explain why to Ellis. He did not fully explain it to himself in that moment. He just wrote the address down and drove out the following morning. Out. He parked on the gravel access road and sat in the truck for a while before getting out. The elevator rose against the flat Kansas sky in the way that only a grain elevator can, functional and vertical and entirely indifferent to aesthetics. The main concrete slip-form cylinder was cracked along 2 visible seams on the south face. The attached steel bin array on the east side had 1 collapsed section near the base. Out. The loading dock overhang had partially detached on the right end and hung at an angle that made it look like a man leaning against a wall he knows is not going to hold him. From the road, it looked like everything Harrison Briggs had decided it was. A liability, a question mark, a piece of garbage. Out. Russell got out of the truck and walked the perimeter without touching anything. He was reading the structure the way he had been trained to read structures, not looking at what was broken but calculating what was not. The main concrete cylinder, despite the surface cracking, sat on a foundation that was visibly intact at grade level. The slip-form pour was original and, from what he could assess without instrumentation, still plumb within acceptable tolerance. He noted the way the structure sat in relation to the prevailing wind direction and the grade of the land. He noted the orientation of the loading dock relative to the county road. He noted the grain pit access covers, which were present and sealed. He walked the 12 acres slowly, not examining the buildings, looking at the land itself, the soil composition in this part of the county, the slope toward the drainage ditch at the eastern edge, the proximity to two separate county roads, and the sign on the fence post at the northwest corner, a small survey stake with a yellow flag placed within the last 2 years by the look of it, marking the edge of a right-of-way expansion project he had read about in a county planning report while doing a contract inspection the previous spring. He did not call Briggs Capital that day. He drove home, sat at the kitchen table his father had built, and spent 4 hours with the county assessor's website, the regional infrastructure planning documents he could access through a state agricultural engineering database, and a topographical survey map he had kept from his years at the firm. By 10 o'clock that night, he had a legal pad covered in numbers on one side and a single sentence on the other side that he underlined twice. He called the number on the listing the next morning. The meeting was brief. Harrison Briggs arrived with his attorney and a facilities coordinator and treated the appointment the way he treated every appointment that did not involve significant money, as an administrative formality that existed to move paper from one place to another. He shook Russell's hand once, with the grip of someone who has shaken too many hands to assign meaning to any of them, and said his team would walk him through the property condition disclosures. He did not ask Russell what he intended to do with the structure. He did not ask anything about Russell at all. At one point, while the facilities coordinator was explaining the electrical disconnection status of the main panel, Harrison took out his phone and answered a message. Russell watched him do this and said nothing. He asked a total of 6 questions during the walkthrough, all of them technical, all of them structural, and Harrison's team answered 4 of them and admitted they did not know the answers to the remaining 2. Russell wrote all of it in his notebook. When they gathered at the folding table the facilities coordinator had set up inside the loading dock, Russell looked at the purchase price on the agreement one more time. $8,000 for the structure and the 12 acres it sat on. He did not negotiate. He signed where indicated, shook Harrison's hand a second time, and put the deed in his jacket. Harrison said something to his attorney on the way to the car. His attorney smiled. They drove back to Wichita. Russell sat in the cab of his truck in the gravel access road for a few minutes after they left. Then he started the engine, pulled out of the access road, drove 3 miles east to a diner in the nearest town, and ordered coffee and eggs and spent an hour writing in his notebook. He had known, walking that property twice, what he was fairly certain was underneath the damage. Not just the structure, which was more recoverable than Harrison's team understood, but the land. The soil profile in this section of the county was among the highest quality dryland agricultural ground remaining in the region. A specific combination of subsoil drainage and loam composition that generations of wheat farming had maintained and that had been sitting idle for 15 years while a firm in Wichita looked at the surface and saw nothing of value. And the right-of-way expansion project, when it was formally announced, would bring a county road upgrade along the northwest boundary that would make this parcel accessible in ways it had never been during its years as a cooperative facility. The logistics firm Harrison planned to sell to would not be the only party interested in this location once that announcement was made. Russell had read the planning document. He had called a contact in the county planning office 2 weeks earlier, a woman he had worked with on a bridge inspection, and asked her a neutral question about the project timeline. She had given him a neutral answer. Formal announcement was expected in the spring. He called his daughter that evening. Her name was Lily, and she was 26, finishing a graduate degree in agricultural economics at Kansas State, and she was the person Russell talked to about everything that mattered. He told her he had bought an old grain elevator. She asked how much. He told her. She was quiet for a moment and then asked if he had done the soil analysis yet. He told her he had not done it formally. He told her what he expected to find out. She was quiet again for a longer moment and then said she thought she could get access to the university's soil testing lab through her department. He said that would be useful. She asked if she could come see it that weekend. He said she should bring boots. Lily drove out Saturday morning. She walked the 12 acres with her father, asking questions he answered and a few he admitted he did not yet know the answers to. When they stood at the base of the main concrete cylinder and she put her hand against the wall, she looked up at the height of it and asked what he was going to do with it. He told her he was not entirely sure yet, but that the structure had a second life if someone was willing to find it out. She told him the soil sample she'd arranged through her lab contact would take 10 days. He thanked her. She told him he was the most stubborn and specific person she had ever met in her life, and that she meant it as a compliment. Mostly. He said mostly was fine. Out. The first month of work was physical and methodical and unglamorous in the way that most real work is unglamorous. Russell hired 2 local men he knew from his county inspection contracts, a laborer named Cole who knew structural concrete, and a retired farmer named Herb who knew grain handling systems the way some people know music intuitively and completely, without needing to read the score. Out. They cleared the collapsed section of the east bin array first, salvaging the steel for resale through a regional scrap broker, which generated $1,100 and, more importantly, cleared the site for a proper structural assessment of what remained. Russell rented testing equipment from a firm in Hutchinson and spent 3 days doing core samples on the main cylinder wall. The results confirmed what he had estimated from the surface. The concrete was structurally sound at depth. Out. The cracking was cosmetic and weather-related, not load-bearing failure. The foundation was solid. The slip-form cylinder, 62 feet tall, was recoverable. Cole looked at the core sample readouts and said he'd seen city buildings in worse shape get renovated into apartments. Russell told him to write that down somewhere because they might need it later. Out. The soil analysis came back from Lily's lab contact 12 days after she collected the samples. The results were better than Russell's estimate. The top 30 inches showed a clay loam composition with organic matter levels that had actually improved during the fallow period, natural restoration from years without chemical application. The subsoil drainage profile was consistent with the county's highest classification dryland farmland. Out. He looked at the report for a long time sitting at the kitchen table. Then he called Lily and read her the numbers. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said quietly that the land alone, if it were properly listed, would probably be assessed at somewhere between 4 and 5 times what he had paid for the entire parcel. He said yes. She asked what he was going to do. He said he was going to farm it. She said she thought that was what he would say. Out. There was a pause, and then she said she wanted to be part of it. He said he had been hoping she would. Out. Lily had 8 months left on her graduate program. She drove out on weekends when she could. During the week, she worked with Russell by phone and email, her academic access to research databases proving more immediately useful than her father had expected. She pulled agricultural land valuation studies for the region and built a projection model for soil remediation timelines and crop rotation sequencing. Out. She found a federal conservation program that offered cost-share funding for the restoration of previously farmed ground that had sat idle for more than 10 years. Callaway County was on the eligible list. The application process was detailed and required documentation that Russell spent 2 weeks assembling from old county records, the cooperative's dissolution files, and the structural assessments he had already completed. Out. He submitted the application on a Tuesday evening and then went back out to the property and kept working. Out. The structural rehabilitation of the main elevator cylinder took 11 weeks. Russell and Cole repaired the exterior cracking using a polymer-modified concrete overlay system that Russell had specified on a commercial project years earlier and knew to be durable in Kansas freeze-thaw cycles. The loading dock overhang was removed entirely, assessed, and rebuilt from salvaged structural steel that Cole sourced through his own contacts at a fraction of new material cost. Out. The interior of the cylinder was cleaned, treated, and inspected for the first time in 15 years. When Cole ran a light up the inside of the 62-foot column and they stood at the base looking up at the circle of daylight at the top, Herb said it was the best-looking elevator shaft he'd seen since the one his grandfather had worked in as a young man. Russell wrote something in his notebook and did not explain what. Out. In February, the county formally announced the right-of-way expansion project. The notice ran in the county paper and on the county website and was also sent to property owners within a specified radius. Russell was on that list. The announcement confirmed what he had been planning around for 5 months. Out. The road upgrade would bring a paved access route along the northwest boundary of his parcel, replacing a gravel section that had made the property effectively inaccessible to commercial traffic for the past decade. With the upgrade, the parcel would have dual county road access for the first time in its history. Out. A regional agricultural journalist named Dana Pruitt, who covered land use stories for a publication based in Salina, called the county planning office 2 weeks after the announcement to ask about properties in the expansion zone. The planning office gave her public information. She drove out to the Callaway elevator site on a cold morning in March and found Russell and Cole repairing the mechanical linkage on the grain pit conveyor system. She told him what she was covering. Out. He said he had 30 minutes. They talked for 2 hours. Out. Lily's conservation program application was approved in April. The cost-share funding covered 60% of the soil remediation and initial planting costs for 8 of the 12 acres. Out. Russell had already contracted with a local certified seed dealer for a winter wheat variety that matched the county's soil profile, and he had arranged a grain marketing agreement with a regional cooperative in the next county that was actively looking for high-quality dryland wheat from independent producers. Out. The cooperative's field representative had driven out to see the property after reading Dana's article, which had run in late March under the headline she had chosen after seeing the elevator rising against the sky, and thinking about who had sold it and who had bought it, and what the difference between those two decisions had cost. She had asked Russell in their conversation what he believed Harrison Briggs had missed. Out. Russell had thought about it for a moment and said that Harrison had looked at the cost of repairing the structure and called that the value of the land, and that he had looked at the land and decided the structure was secondary information. Dana wrote that down and used it almost exactly as he said it. Out. The first wheat planting went into the ground in October, 11 months after Russell had signed the deed in the loading dock with the wind coming off the flat Kansas plain and Harrison Briggs already halfway to his car. 8 acres of dryland winter wheat, seeded into soil that the university lab had graded in the top tier of its regional classification system. Out. Herb operated the seeder and said very little while he worked, which was the way Herb communicated that he approved of what he was doing. Out. Harrison Briggs read Dana's article when it was forwarded to him by his facilities director, who attached a note that contained only a question mark. Harrison read it twice. He forwarded it to his attorney without comment. His attorney called him back the following day and suggested a brief conversation about whether the original sale had accurately disclosed the soil quality assessment. Harrison said his team had not conducted one. Out. His attorney said that was the answer she expected and that the disclosure agreement Russell had signed was standard and comprehensive. Harrison said he understood. He sat at his desk for a while after the call and looked at the document from the original transaction that his assistant had pulled and set on his desk. $8,000. His attorney's review fee for the phone call that morning had been $400. Out. He put the document back in the folder and asked his assistant to schedule his next meeting. Out. The formal property appraisal that Russell commissioned in November, 12 months after the purchase, placed the value of the rehabilitated structure and the 12 acres at $380,000. The 8 acres under winter wheat, based on the soil classification and the secured marketing agreement, carried an additional income projection that the appraiser noted would likely generate between $40,000 and $60,000 in the first harvest year if conditions held. Out. The conservation program funding had covered the largest portion of the remediation cost. Russell's total out-of-pocket investment, including the purchase price, structural rehabilitation, soil work, seed and planting, and the cost share match he had contributed, was just under $70,000. The appraised value was more than 5 times that number. Out. The appraiser, a woman who had worked in agricultural land valuation in the region for 22 years, told Russell that it was the most significant single-year value recovery on an idle agricultural parcel she had seen in her career. She said it in the same tone someone uses when they are trying to be accurate rather than congratulatory. He thanked her and meant it. Out. Lily finished her graduate degree in May. She drove to Callaway County the weekend after her last exam with 2 boxes of books and a framed photograph from a field research trip she had taken during her program, a wide shot of dryland wheat at full head in late June light, taken somewhere in the western part of the state that looked very much like this. 12 acres looked in her imagination when she thought about what it would look like in a year. Out. She hung the photograph in the small office space Russell had set up in the refurbished section of the loading dock, on the wall that faced the main cylinder. She told him she was ready to start. He handed her the legal pad with the outline he had been developing for the formal business structure. She sat down and read the whole thing without speaking. When she finished, she said there were 2 things she wanted to change and 1 thing she wanted to add. He said to go ahead. Out. She picked up the pen and started writing. Out. Dana Pruitt wrote a second piece that fall longer than the first, that ran in 2 regional publications and was picked up by a national agricultural trade journal. She had followed the story across 11 months and written it the way agricultural journalists write their best stories, with attention to the land itself as much as the people working on it. She asked Russell near the end of their final interview what the hardest part of the year had been. Out. He said it was the 3 weeks in March when a late freeze threatened the newly seeded test plots in the conservation area, and he had no way of knowing until the ground thawed whether the seed had survived. He said he had gone out to the field every morning for 22 days, and crouched down and looked at the soil surface and tried to read what was happening underneath. Dana asked what he was looking for. Out. He said he was looking for anything that told him the seed was still alive down there, doing what it was supposed to do in the dark, even when there was no visible evidence of it yet. He said that patience and attentiveness are the same skill when the stakes are real. She asked if the seed had survived. He said every row came up. She asked if he could describe what it looked like. He was quiet for a moment. He said it looked like every good decision he had ever made arriving at the same time. Out. Dana asked at the end of the interview whether he had heard from Harrison Briggs since the sale. Russell said he had not. She asked if he expected to. He said he did not know and did not spend much time thinking about it. She asked what he would say to him if he did hear from him. Russell was quiet for longer this time. He said he thought Harrison had done him a service by being certain too quickly. Out. He said that certainty in other people creates opportunity for people who are willing to look more carefully. He said he bore no resentment toward the man. He said that was true. Dana believed him. She wrote that part of the conversation down verbatim because she knew that some things lose something when they are paraphrased. Out. Lily was standing in the doorway of the loading dock office during that exchange, out of Dana's line of sight, having walked in partway through. She heard what her father said and did not interrupt. After Dana left, she brought him a cup of coffee and set it on the desk and asked him if he actually meant that, about owing Harrison something. He thought about it in the way he thought about everything, fully and without hurrying. Out. He said that he had spent his whole career being the kind of person that certain other people did not think to look at carefully. He said that had cost him things over the years. But he said that, in this case, it had handed him 12 acres of the best dryland soil in the county for $8,000 and a cold morning in October. He said he was not sure gratitude was the right word, but he said resentment would have been a waste of what had been given to him. Out. Lily wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the photograph of the wheat field on the wall and did not say anything for a while. Outside, the November wind was moving across the 12 acres in the way it always moves across flat Kansas land, steadily, without apology, paying no attention to what any particular person has decided about what the ground is worth. Out. The winter wheat came up in April. Russell drove out before sunrise on the morning Herb called to say the first emergence was visible, and he stood in the field with the early light coming flat across the rows and looked at what 8 months of patience and one specific way of seeing had produced. Out. The green was thin and exact and covered every row from the fence line to the drainage ditch, which meant the seed had not just survived the freeze, but had established with the kind of root depth that the soil profile had promised it would. He stood there for a long time without taking out his notebook or his phone. He just stood in the field and looked at it. Out. A man who had been told, in the language of an $8,000 deed and a dismissive ride back to Wichita, that what he was looking at was not worth looking at. Standing in 12 acres of evidence that some things are only invisible to the people who have already decided what they are going to see. Out. I keep thinking about that moment when Russell crouched down in the field for 22 straight mornings, looking at frozen ground for signs that the seed was still alive underneath. No guarantee, no visible evidence. Just a man who had done the right work, made the right call, and then had to wait and trust what he could not yet see. That image stays with me more than the appraisal number, more than the deed, more than any of it. Out. What Harrison had was certainty, and certainty, when it arrives too fast and without real examination, has a cost that someone else usually pays and then collects on later. He looked at 12 acres of Kansas land and saw liability. He saw the cracked concrete, the collapsed steel, the 15 years of silence, and he made his calculation in the time it takes to sign a name. That calculation cost him somewhere in the neighborhood of $370,000. Out. Not because the universe was punishing him for arrogance. That kind of thinking lets people off too easy, but because the world consistently rewards the people who look more carefully than everyone else has bothered to. Out. Russell didn't win because he got lucky. He won because he had spent a career building the kind of mind that doesn't stop at the surface of things. That's not a talent you're born with. That's something you earn through years of honest work, through paying attention when it would have been easier not to, through caring about the difference between what something looks like and what it actually is. Out. That's the thing I think about when I think about what made him different from the man who sold him that property. It wasn't resources. It wasn't connections. It was the discipline to keep seeing clearly when everyone around him had already looked away. Out. And then there's the part of the story that I think gets overlooked. Russell didn't just see the value in the land. He did the work to bring it forward. He got up before sunrise. He drove the 40 minutes. He hired Cole and Herb and trusted their expertise the same way he wanted his own expertise trusted. He filled out the conservation paperwork and assembled the records, and waited 10 days for the soil lab results, and then, when the numbers confirmed what he had believed, he didn't celebrate. He went back to work. That kind of steadiness, doing the next right thing without needing the outcome to arrive before you're ready to keep moving. That's the thing that separates people who see opportunity from people who actually build something from it. Lily is part of this story in a way that matters. She didn't just show up with boots and soil samples. She brought her full self to her father's vision before it was anything more than a legal pad and a hunch. She asked the hard questions. She built the projection model. She hung a photograph of wheat in a field on the office wall before there was wheat in the field. That kind of faith isn't naive. It's built on knowing someone well enough to trust the quality of their judgment, even when the ground is still frozen and the outcome is still invisible. I think we're taught, most of us, to look at what's in front of us and take the surface reading as the complete one. That lesson costs people a great deal over a lifetime. What Russell understood, and what I try to carry with me from his story, is that the surface is just the beginning of the question, not the end of it. The real answer is almost always underneath, waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough and determined enough to go find it.